July 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Nazi Germany had been crushed under the weight of millions of Allied and Soviet soldiers. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the battlefields of the West fell silent. But on the other side of the world, Japan, surrounded, bombed and starving, still fought tooth and nail. The Allied generals were exhausted. The Pacific beaches had been stained with American blood. Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each island conquered was a hell of trenches, caves, mines, fire and death. And each advance was costly, very costly. It is estimated that an all-out invasion of the Japanese home islands, called Operation Downfall, could result in up to 1 million dead among the Allies and tens of millions on the Japanese side. The civilian casualty estimates were so brutal that some of President Harry Truman's aides hesitated even to speak the numbers aloud. But Japan would not give in. Even after months of relentless air raids, even with cities turned to coal, by firebombs, the Japanese imperial government refused to surrender. They had a code of honor, the Bushido, who saw surrender as a shame worse than death. For the Americans, there remained a last card, a secret weapon, a god up your sleeve. For years, in absolute secrecy, the United States had been developing the greatest and most dangerous creation of modern science, a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. An explosion capable of swallowing entire cities. A power previously only imagined in nightmares or science fiction. It was called Manhattan Project. Begun in 1939 and accelerated when Einstein warned President Roosevelt about the potential of nuclear fission, the project involved more than 130,000 people spread across secret bases in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. Scientists, engineers, military personnel, all sworn to absolute silence. They operated in underground bunkers, wearing coded badges, guarded by soldiers armed to the teeth. And what they built there, in the depths of the desert, was not an ordinary bomb. The end of the world, encapsulated in steel and uranium. When Germany fell, the question changed. Should we use this in Japan? The military did not hesitate. The objective was clear. Force an immediate and total surrender, prevent the invasion, prevent the carnage on Japanese soil, but at the cost of a single attack that could annihilate tens of thousands of civilians in seconds. President Truman, newly inaugurated after Roosevelt's death, made the most momentous decision in modern history. With a single command, authorized the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. It was like turning the key to an apocalypse. The fate of an entire city and of humanity now depended on one bomber, one crew, and one bomb with the innocent name of Little Boy. The birth of the bomb. It all started with an idea, a dangerous, almost mythical idea, splitting the atom. Something so small and yet so powerful that, if controlled, it could release an energy greater than any explosive ever created by humanity. In 1938, German scientists discovered that the uranium atom could be split in two, and in doing so, released an absurd amount of energy. The academic world trembled. Nazism knew it. War was at hand, and science, for the first time, was about to fabricate its own doomsday. It was then that the United States acted. With the support of brilliant minds, like Albert Einstein, who signed the initial letter to President Roosevelt, was born what would become the largest scientific military project in history, the Manhattan Project. 3 secret locations formed the pillars of this plan. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where they enriched uranium, filtering invisible particles in gigantic cylinders with machines that seemed to come from another world. Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was produced in experimental reactors that glowed with an unsettling light. Los Alamos, New Mexico, the brains of the project, where the greatest physicists on Earth gathered to design, assemble and test the first atomic device in history. These men, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, and so many others, played with forces that even they did not fully understand, and they knew it. Oppenheimer, the project leader, walked between the laboratories with a blank look in his eyes. He read the Vedas, the sacred texts of ancient India, while its engineers built weapons with the potential to erase entire cities. He knew what they were about to unleash. On July 16, 1945, the world crossed a line from which it would never return. In the desert of Alamogordo in New Mexico, at 5:29 a.m., the first nuclear explosion in history was carried out. The test was codenamed Trinity. What happened at that moment was beyond science. It was almost spiritual. A white flash illuminated the dawn, transforming the darkness into a macabre day. A fireball rose into the sky, followed by a mushroom cloud that reached kilometers into the air. The ground shook. Windows shattered more than 100 miles away. The soldiers and scientists watching through sunglasses and digging trenches were silent. No one celebrated. One of them fell to his knees. Another vomited. Oppenheimer just whispered, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." The weapon was ready. The test was a success. Now it was only a matter of time until this creation, forged in the desert and fueled by fear, science, and ambition, was used against a real city, against real people, and the target already had a name: Hiroshima. Hiroshima, the target city. While the desert skies still carried the dust of the Trinity test, American military personnel gathered in secret rooms with a single objective: choose where the bomb would fall. Tokyo was already in ruins. Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama, all had been burned to the bone by months of conventional bombing. But Hiroshima was virtually intact, and that made her perfect. Hiroshima was an ideal target. With about 350,000 inhabitants, was a port city in southern Japan, surrounded by mountains and cut through by rivers that formed a delta. From above, it seemed peaceful, organized. But the Americans saw something else: a military and industrial center. It was the headquarters of the Japanese Second General Army, which coordinated the defense of the entire south of the country. It housed ammunition factories, communication centers, supply depots, and military training camps. There were also large numbers of Korean forced laborers and Chinese prisoners, all invisible to the eyes of war, but marked for death. But there was an even more cruel reason for choosing Hiroshima. She had never been bombed before. This would allow the American military clearly observe the effects of the atomic bomb on a clean city. There would be no confusion, no pre-existing damage, just a single impact, measured in real time, like a gigantic experiment on human lives. Yes, Hiroshima was chosen as a target and as a laboratory at the same time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the city's residents went about their daily lives with a certain illusion of security. They knew about the war. They felt the lack of food. They heard the planes passing in the distance. But many believed that Hiroshima would never be attacked. There was no major naval base there. And since the city had never been bombed, rumors arose that the Americans wanted to preserve Hiroshima to take it after the war. They were wrong, very wrong. On July 25, 1945, President Truman formally authorized the atomic attack. The document was dry, direct, and emotionless. The order had been given. The objective was simple: drop the first special bomb as soon as weather permits. The list of casualties: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. The day was approaching. The city lived as if it were just another one in Japan. But it was about to be the first in the world to disappear in a single instant. The Enola Gay mission in. The dark dawn of August 6, 1945, at an advanced airbase on the island of Tinian in the Marianas. The silence was broken only by the roar of the engines warming up. On the track, under armed guard, was a B-29 Superfortress bomber gleaming in the moonlight. Its name, painted in black beneath the cabin, was simple, almost harmless: Enola Gay, name of the pilot's mother. But that plane was carrying something no mother could ever imagine. Inside its bomb bay, secured with steel hooks and wrapped in sensors and wires, was the most powerful weapon humankind had ever created. Little Boy, weighing about tons, 71 centimeters in diameter and almost 3 meters long, Little Boy was a monster disguised as a metal cylinder. Its interior carried highly enriched uranium-235, and its trigger was designed to detonate the bomb at approximately 600 meters above the ground, the exact point where it would cause as much destruction as possible. The mission was led by Colonel Paul Tibbets, 30 years old, young, cold, trained to follow orders, and carrying in their hands the destiny of hundreds of thousands of people. At 2:45 in the morning, the Enola Gay took flight. Alongside it, 2 other B-29s followed, one with scientific measuring equipment, another to film the explosion, as if they were executioners leading witnesses to a historic execution. For hours, the crew flew in silence, crossing the Pacific Ocean at high altitudes, avoiding radar and not knowing exactly what they would find. In Hiroshima, the morning began calmly. The clock pointed to 8 a.m. Students walked to school, workers swept the streets, merchants opened their shops, and in the skies, only 3 tiny dots appeared in the distance. The airborne warning siren sounded briefly at 7:30 a.m., but was cancelled shortly thereafter. Just 3 planes with no escort squadrons posed no threat. Many did not even seek shelter. And then at 8:15 a.m., a hatch opened no ventre do Enola Gay. The bomb fell slowly, spinning in the air with a stabilizing parachute. He had 43 seconds until he reached the detonation point. 43 seconds, the time of a prayer, or the time to die in silence without knowing the reason. From above, Colonel Tibbets saw the light. It looked like the sun had come down to earth, he said later. I closed my eyes and could still see the light through my eyelids. The world would never be the same again, and Hiroshima no longer existed. 8:15 in the morning, the bomb Little Boy exploded at exactly 42 meters above downtown Hiroshima. The detonation point was carefully calculated for a single purpose: cause as much destruction as possible. And that's what happened. First came the flash, a silent white flash, brighter than the sun. It only lasted 1/10 of a second, but it was enough to temporarily blind everyone who looked directly at him. Right away, a thermal explosion devastating spread in all directions, with temperatures exceeding 1004, the epicenter, hotter than the surface of the sun. People near downtown Hiroshima simply evaporated, their bodies disintegrated in less than a second. Others, further away, were instantly charred. Their bodies, frozen in everyday gestures, turned into coal statues. Human shadows were engraved on the walls, perfectly imprinted by radiation. What remained of men, women, and children. Soon after came the shockwave. Supersonic winds of more than 1,000 km/h swept through the city. Buildings collapsed. Glass turned into deadly projectiles. Tremors shook Hiroshima like a monstrous earthquake. Bridges collapsed, trams were thrown into the air, houses turned into bonfires. What was not destroyed by the explosion caught fire. The entire city turned into a living hell. Wood, paper, fabric, skin, hair, everything was burning. The flames engulfed the blocks. Screams, roars, and cries began to appear in the middle of the smoke, but most of them just disappeared. Nearly 80,000 people died instantly, without knowing, without understanding, without a chance. Hiroshima, a living city minutes before, was now a cemetery on fire. On the banks of the rivers, survivors began to emerge, as ghosts coming out of hell. They came staggering, naked, or with pieces of clothing fused to their flesh. As mice hung like rags, the eyes swollen and burned, the hair in ashes, and yet many were still standing, walking slowly, like dead who refused to fall. The bomb had fallen from the sky. But what followed? It was not an explosion. It was the descent of hell itself upon Earth. The explosion had happened in a single spot in the sky. Mass shockwave that she created was like a giant fist crushing the whole of Hiroshima. In less than a second, the surrounding air was compressed and expanded violently, creating a brutal pressure that spread like an invisible tsunami. What was once a living city with wooden houses, schools, temples, bridges and markets was devastated, as if the gods had run a flaming steamroller over everything. The structure closest to the epicenter have completely disappeared. No ruins, no bricks, no bones. People literally turned to dust. Further away from the center, the scene was almost even crueler. Walls exploded outward. Entire roofs flew away like leaves in the wind. Logs of wood were thrown like spears and pierced bodies like projectiles. The concrete lampposts, they twisted like hot dough. On the electric tram tracks, a vehicle following its morning route was launched over 100 meters, crushing its passengers against the iron. And windows. Those who were inside houses were buried by flaming pieces of their own lives. Many tried to run into the street, only to see the ground covered in flames and bodies. And even those who were outside, in the open air, did not escape. The force of the wave threw them against walls, trees, sidewalks, broken arms, crushed skulls, broken spines. Some survivors remained forever mute, not because of trauma, but because their vocal cords were burned or their throats were covered in debris and smoke. And then came the silence. A horrible silence, unnatural, the kind of silence that only exists when almost everyone has already died. In a matter of seconds, Hiroshima was erased, but what remained would still suffer for hours, days, years. And as radioactive dust began to spread across the sky, the first trembling steps of the survivors began to emerge from the smoking rubble. Faceless men, armless women, children carrying dead brothers. The city had been wiped off the map, but the human tragedy was just beginning. The explosion had happened in a single spot in the sky. Mass shockwave that she created was like a giant fist crushing the whole of Hiroshima. In less than a second, the surrounding air was compressed and expanded violently, creating a brutal pressure that spread like an invisible tsunami. What was once a living city with wooden houses, schools, temples, bridges and markets was devastated as if the gods had run a flaming steamroller over everything. The structures closest to the epicenter have completely disappeared. No ruins, no bricks, no bones. People literally turned to dust. Further away from the center, the scene was almost even crueler. Walls exploded outward. Entire roofs flew away like leaves in the wind. Logs of wood were thrown like spears and pierced bodies like projectiles. The concrete lampposts, they twisted like hot dough. On the electric tram tracks, a vehicle following its morning route was launched over 100 meters, crushing its passengers against the iron and windows. Those who were inside houses were buried by flaming pieces of their own lives. Many tried to run into the street, only to see the ground covered in flames and bodies. And even those who were outside, in the open air, did not escape. The force of the wave threw them against walls, trees, sidewalks, broken arms, crushed skulls, broken spines. Some survivors remained forever mute, not because of trauma, but because their vocal cords were burned or their throats were covered in debris and smoke. And then came this silence, a horrible silence, unnatural, the kind of silence that only exists when almost everyone has already died. In a matter of seconds, Hiroshima was erased, but what remained would still suffer for hours, days, years. And as radioactive dust began to spread across the sky, the first trembling steps of the survivors began to emerge from the smoking rubble. Faceless men, armless women, children carrying dead brothers. The city had been wiped off the map, but the human tragedy was just beginning. Hours after the explosion, when the dust began to settle, the true extent of the horror was revealed. But Hiroshima no longer existed. From a vibrant city with more than 350,000 inhabitants, there remained ashes, blood, and rubble. The landscape was indescribable. No landmarks remained. The streets had disappeared, the houses crushed or burned. Temples, schools, banks, shops, everything had been pulverized. The epicenter became a burning hole. The few buildings that were not reduced to rubble were charred, with twisted structures like metal claws pointing to the sky, as if they were begging for revenge. The city clocks stopped exactly at 15 a.m. Time for Hiroshima had frozen at the moment of the explosion. On all sides, there were bodies piled up on the sidewalks in grotesque positions, as if death had arrived in the middle of a conversation. People lying down holding hands, mothers hugging their children, faceless soldiers, and a terrifying detail, almost all naked. The thermal blast was so intense that it burned through clothing in seconds, and where the clothes did not burn, marked their bodies with strange patterns like tattoos of agony. The city was dead, but alive enough to suffer. The few survivors who could still walk wandered aimlessly, many without knowing his own name, others carrying parts of loved ones in pieces. The temples and schools, which in times of war had been transformed into shelters and infirmaries, were full of dying people, agonizing on the wooden floor, amid flies, radioactive dust, and low crying. No doctors, no medicine, no morphine. Some preferred throw themselves into the rivers to die. Others begged to be killed. Hell is not a place of fire and demons. Hell is what remains of Hiroshima. And meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the radio remained silent. Japan didn't know what had happened. The Americans knew, and they were analyzing the data, because for scientists and military personnel, Hiroshima was also an experiment, the Black Rain. When the sky darkened in mid-morning, many thought it was the end of times, but it wasn't the end. The second act of a nightmare that was still far from over. Just hours after the explosion, as Hiroshima burned in flames and groans, dark clouds began to form in the sky. They rose from the city like smoke, but they carried something far worse. Radioactive dust, soot, uranium particles, blood, burned skin, and human ashes. The sky wept over what men had done, and then it started to fall, the black rain. It was thick, oily, almost sticky, black drops like ink, loaded with deadly radiation. To the survivors, burned, thirsty, delirious, that dark water seemed like a gift from heaven. They stretched out their hands. Some opened their mouths and they drank the rain, believing they were being saved. But they were, in fact, absorbing the poison that would slowly kill. This rain fell on wounded skin, on open eyes, on exposed wounds. It entered the lungs, the blood, the bones, and nobody knew. Most of them didn't even imagine what it was. Radiation. At that time, the world did not understand the effects of the atomic bomb. They knew the heat, they knew the explosion, but not the invisible, silent, relentless poisoning. In the following days, the first symptoms began. Violent nausea, bleeding without apparent cause, hair falling out in clumps, wounds that did not heal, Pele that necrosava alive. Men who had survived the explosion began to die without explanation. Children who seemed fine the next day, they passed out and never woke up again. Pregnant women began to miscarry in silence, with lost eyes and empty arms. The rain had brought what the bomb left behind: delayed death, the slow sentence, and the worst part, this part of the tragedy was invisible. There was no fire, there was no explosion, just bodies fainting, one by one, in silence. The bomb had exploded only once, but its effect would continue killing. For weeks, months, decades. Hibakusha, the lives the bomb didn't erase. The moment the artificial sun exploded over Hiroshima and 3 days later over Nagasaki, the world changed forever. For those who, by a cruel twist of fate, survived the blinding flash, the shockwave that pulverized the city, and the ominous black rain that followed, life took on a new and terrifying name: Hibakusha, a Japanese word that literally means people affected by the bomb. But survival wasn't a fluke. It was the prologue to a nightmare that would last a lifetime, etched into skin, bones, and soul. The body as a map of pain. The visible wounds were a grotesque testament to the bomb's power. Skin, for many, became a canvas of horror. Third-degree burns covered entire bodies, melting the skin and fusing it with the fabric of clothing. Thick, misshapen keloid scars grew like monstrous lumps, pulling at the skin, restricting movement, and transforming faces into masks of permanent pain. Hands that once worked and caressed became atrophied claws. Eyes that had seen the explosion were blinded, their corneas burned. Mouths that once smiled were deformed, making speech and eating a daily challenge. And then there was the invisible enemy, radiation. It crept into bodies silently, like a ghost, and began its work of destruction from within. The lungs, even of those far from the blast, were compromised. The blood system was attacked, leading to leukemia and other cancers that would emerge years, even decades later. The simple act of breathing, of living, became a constant reminder of that day, the invisible pain of the soul and social stigma. If physical pain was torment, the pain of the soul was an abyss. The Hibakusha didn't just carry their physical scars. They carried the weight of what they saw, memories of rivers filled with bodies, of charred figures trapped in their final gestures, of children calling out for parents who would never answer. Post-traumatic stress was a constant. Shadow, haunting their dreams and their days. Worse still, many faced contempt and rejection from their own society. Fear of the unknown, the dread of radiation, turned into ignorance and prejudice. Hibakusha was shunned. People feared that the bomb disease was contagious. They were seen as cursed, marked. For young people, this meant difficulties in getting married. Families feared their offspring would be born with defects. At work, they were discriminated against, considered weak or prone to disease. They survived the bomb, only to be wounded again by words and isolation. The shadow over future generations. The most terrifying question for a Hibakusha was not about his own future, but about the future of his children. What will the radiation do to them and to my grandchildren? This uncertainty was a form of slow torture. Many saw their children born with terrible deformities or develop rare and aggressive childhood diseases. Every cough, every fever a child developed was a cause for panic. The shadow of slow death, which had followed them since 1945, now stretched over subsequent generations, a cursed legacy they never wanted to leave behind. The unshakable strength of the witness. But even amidst so much pain, the Hibakusha resisted. With a strength that defies comprehension, they refused to be mere victims. They rebuilt their lives brick by brick on the ruins of their cities and their bodies. They transformed their pain into purpose. They became living witnesses to nuclear horror, the most powerful voices in the clamor for a world without atomic weapons. They traveled the world telling their stories, not for revenge, but to ensure that no other city, no other person would suffer what they had. Every scar on their bodies became a paragraph in their story, every tear shed a word of warning. In their weary eyes, there was not only the memory of hell, but the flame of stubborn hope. They are the silent cry against the insanity of war, a perpetual reminder that beneath the mushroom cloud there are no victors, only shattered lives and the courage of those who, even broken, chose to fight for peace. Hibakusha, the infinite echo of the explosion. The moment the artificial sun exploded over Hiroshima and 3 days later over Nagasaki, time shattered. For those who, by a cruel twist of fate, survived the flash that erased shadows and the shockwave that pulverized matter, life gained a new and terrifying name, Hibakusha, a Japanese word that literally means people affected by the bomb, but whose weight transcends any definition. Survival wasn't a fluke. It was a condemnation to a fractured existence. It was the prologue to a nightmare that would last a lifetime, etched in skin, bones, blood, and soul. The body as a map of pain and cellular memory. The visible wounds were a grotesque testament to the bomb's power. For many, skin became a canvas of horror. Third-degree burns covered entire bodies, melting the skin and fusing it with the fabric of clothing, creating an armor of agony. Thick, misshapen keloid scars grew like monstrous bulges, pulling at the skin, limiting movement, and transforming faces into masks of permanent pain. Hands that once worked and caressed became atrophied claws. Eyes that had seen the blast were blinded, their corneas burned. Mouths that once smiled were deformed, making speech and eating a daily challenge. But the real terror lay in the invisible enemy, radiation. It penetrated bodies silently, like a ghost, and ignited a cellular war. Bone marrow, the factory of life, was the first to fail. Blood cell production plummeted, resulting in severe anemia, uncontrollable bleeding, and a decimated immune system. A simple infection could be fatal. As the years passed, radiation revealed its most sinister nature. Cancers of all kinds, leukemia, thyroid, stomach, lung, bloomed like a late and macabre harvest. The simple act of living became a constant vigil, an anxious monitoring of one's own body, waiting for the next symptom, the next sentence. The invisible pain of the soul and inner exile. If physical pain was torment, the pain of the soul was an abyss. The Hibakusha didn't just carry their scars, they carried the weight of what they saw and what they did to survive. Memories of rivers filled with bodies, of charred figures trapped in their final gestures, of children calling out for parents who would never answer. Survivors' guilt haunted them. Why did I live and they didn't? This question echoed in the moments of silence, a self-imposed torture. Worse still, many faced contempt and rejection from their own society. Fear of the unknown, the dread of radiation, turned into ignorance and prejudice. Hibakusha were shunned. People feared that the bomb disease was contagious. They were seen as cursed, marked by an invisible impurity. For the young, this meant social exile. Families forbade marriage to Hibakusha, fearing their offspring would be born with defects. Or work, they were discriminated against, considered weak or a liability. They survived the world's most powerful weapon, only to be wounded again by the words and isolation of their neighbors. The perpetual shadow over future generations. The most terrifying question for a Hibakusha was not about his own future, but about that of his children. What will the radiation in my blood do to them and to my grandchildren? This uncertainty was a form of slow, intergenerational torture. Many saw their children born with microcephaly, intellectual disabilities, or other deformities. They saw daughters suffer miscarriages and sons develop cancer in their youth. Every cough, every fever of a child was a cause for panic. The shadow of slow death, which had followed them since 1945, now stretched over subsequent generations, a cursed and invisible inheritance they never wanted to leave behind. The unwavering strength of witness and the duty to remember. But even amidst so much pain, the Hibakusha resisted. With a strength that defies comprehension, they refused to be mere victims. They rebuilt their lives brick by brick on the ruins of their cities and their bodies. They transformed their pain into a sacred purpose. They became living witnesses to nuclear horror, the most powerful voices in the clamor for a world without atomic weapons. They traveled the world, telling their stories not for revenge, but to fulfill a duty to the dead and the unborn, to ensure that no other city, no other person would suffer what they had. Every scar on their bodies became a paragraph in their story. Every tear shed, a word of warning. In their weary eyes, there was not only the memory of hell, but the flame of stubborn hope. They are the silent cry against the insanity of war. A perpetual reminder that beneath the mushroom cloud, There are no victors, only shattered lives, and the courage of those who, even broken, chose to fight for peace and memory. The dead, silence, the void. After the end of the world, after the deafening roar that tore through the heavens and the fiery inferno that consumed Hiroshima, an unnatural silence descended upon the city. It wasn't the peace of a conflict's end, but the silence of emptiness, the silence of the dead and those who wished they were. It was a physical silence where the sounds of life, the laughter of children, the rumble of streetcars, the murmur of commerce, had been extinguished and replaced by the ringing in the ears of survivors and the low crackling of the last embers. But this was only the first and most obvious of the silences. Others, deeper and more terrifying, were beginning to set in. The silence of misunderstanding, the collapse of reality. In Tokyo, the imperial government was paralyzed, immersed in a silence of shock and denial. The first reports arriving from Hiroshima were so absurd they seemed delirious. They spoke of an entire city annihilated by a single flash, of human shadows permanently etched into stone, walls of heat that melted glass and metal. The scale of the destruction was so absolute that it defied military logic and human comprehension. What weapon could have done this? Was it an attack with a new type of conventional explosive on an unimaginable scale? Or something else entirely, something bordering on the supernatural? As High Command struggled to decipher the enigma, the lack of clear information created a vacuum of power and action. Aid was slow to arrive, not only because routes were destroyed, but also because no one knew what kind of aid to send. Was it a natural disaster, a chemical attack, an act of God? The lack of a category for the horror paralyzed the response. Clinical silence, the mystery of deathbeds. In the makeshift hospitals and first aid stations that still stood on the outskirts of the devastated city, a second silence descended, the silence of medical ignorance. Doctors and nurses, accustomed to war wounds, shrapnel, burns, fractures, were confronted with a terrifying and inexplicable clinical picture. Patients who had escaped the blast with seemingly minor injuries began to deteriorate dramatically. Small cuts refused to heal. Purple spots appeared spontaneously under the skin, as if the blood had lost its cohesion. Gums bled uncontrollably. Hair fell out in clumps, leaving their skulls bare and vulnerable. A high fever developed, accompanied by an overwhelming weakness that no amount of medication or rest could alleviate. Desperate doctors examined patients and found no cause. Internal organs seemed to be falling apart. Blood tests showed a catastrophic drop in white blood cell counts, leaving bodies defenseless. It was as if the very life force was being drained by an invisible thief. They were witnessing in real time the acute effects of radiation poisoning, but they had no name for it. They called it bomb disease, a vague term for an illness that silently corroded bodies from the inside out. The enforced silence, censorship and narrative control. As the truth began to emerge, brought by Japanese scientists who dared to investigate the ruins, a third, more deliberate silence was imposed. First, by the Japanese government itself, which, even after surrender, feared mass panic and national humiliation by admitting the scale of its defeat and the nature of the weapon that vanquished it. Soon after, this silence was reinforced and amplified by the American occupation forces. A strict censorship code was implemented. Any mention of the effects of radiation, any photographs of victims, any scientific articles or reports describing the ongoing suffering of the Hibakusha were banned. The Allies, especially the United States, needed to control the narrative. The bomb was presented to the world as a powerful weapon that ended the war and saved lives, not as an agent of indiscriminate and lasting suffering that continued to kill months and years after the explosion. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became open-air laboratories, but their results were state secrets. The doctors who treated the sick and the scientists who studied the effects were silenced. The Hibakusha themselves, already stigmatized, were effectively forbidden from telling their stories to the world. Their suffering was rendered invisible, locked behind a curtain of official silence. Existential silence, the fracture of humanity. Meanwhile, in the global scientific community, the silence was one of awe. Physicists who had celebrated the fission of the atom as a triumph of human intellect now gazed in horror at their creation. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, thought of the Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The world had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Humanity now possessed the capacity to self-destruct, to bring about its own extinction. War was no longer a matter of armies on a battlefield. It was an existential threat to all. Civilization, this final silence, the deepest of all, hung over the global consciousness. It was the silence that follows a question no one dares answer. What have we done? In the vacuum left by the explosion, a single terrible certainty crystallized. Humanity's innocence, if it ever existed, had been lost forever in the ashes of Hiroshima. The nuclear age had begun, not with a cry of triumph, but with the deathly silence of a future irrevocably altered. Nagasaki, the second atomic hammer. Less than 4 days after the unspeakable hell that fell upon Hiroshima, humanity, still stunned and in denial, would be struck again. The world had barely begun to process the scale of the annihilation of an entire city when fate was already setting the stage for a repeat of the horror. The message was clear, brutal, and undeniable. The era of war had changed forever. Boxcar's mission, a shadow in the sky. In the early hours of August 9, 1945, the B-29 bomber named Boxcar took off from the Pacific island of Tinian. It was no ordinary mission. Inside, it carried the second and last atomic weapon to be used in combat, the bomb nicknamed Fat Man. Unlike the little boy that pulverized Hiroshima, a uranium weapon, simpler in design but equally devastating. Fat Man was a plutonium beast, more complex, heavier, and in theory even more lethal by design. Its destructive power was intrinsic and terrifying, the result of years of research and billions of dollars invested in the Manhattan Project. The crew of the Boxcar, under the command of Major Charles Sweeney, had a clear order: deliver nuclear death over Kokura, a vital Japanese industrial center. But fate, or perhaps luck, intervened. Upon arriving over Kokura, the sky was shrouded in a dense layer of clouds and smoke, remnants of previous conventional bombing raids in the region. After 3 failed passes, with fuel dwindling and visibility zero, Sweeney made the decision that would seal the fate of another city. Change targets. The second target, Plan B, was Nagasaki. Nagasaki, the city chosen by chance. Nagasaki, a vibrant port city nestled between mountains and crisscrossed by valleys, was a strategic center for the Japanese war effort's armaments and shipbuilding. With a population of approximately 270,000, the city didn't have the same population density as Hiroshima, but its unique topography, with narrow valleys, would have concentrated the force of the explosion differently, channeling a shockwave and heat in devastating ways. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man was dropped. It did not explode directly over the city center as planned, but over the Urakami Valley, a densely populated area home to major factories and Urakami Cathedral, the largest Catholic church in Asia. The bomb detonated at an altitude of approximately 500 meters, releasing an energy equivalent to 21 kilotons of TNT, almost twice the power of the Hiroshima bomb. The flash was more intense, the heat more searing, the shock wave more violent. Hell repeated, destruction and agony. What followed was a replay on a larger scale of the inferno of Hiroshima. Within milliseconds, the temperature in the hypocenter reached millions of degrees Celsius. Everything within a 1.5 mile radius of ground zero was instantly vaporized or reduced to ash. Concrete and steel buildings were crushed like matchboxes. People, going about their daily lives, were transformed into charred shadows or simply vanished, leaving only their outlines etched into the asphalt and walls. The shockwave, an invisible wall of brute force, swept through the valleys, flattening everything in its path. Winds of hundreds of miles per hour uprooted trees, tossed vehicles, and flung human bodies incredible distances. The heat, an instantaneous furnace, ignited everything flammable, creating a firestorm that consumed what the blast hadn't destroyed. The air became unbreathable, filled with dust, smoke, and the sickening, sweet smell of burning flesh. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. An estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people lost their lives at the time of the explosion or in the hours that followed. Thousands more would die in the following days, weeks, months, and years, victims of horrific burns, internal injuries, and most importantly, radiation sickness, an invisible and relentless enemy that ate away at bodies from within in a slow, agonizing torment. The psychological impact and inevitable surrender. The physical and psychological impact of the second attack was devastating, not only for the survivors of Nagasaki, but for the entire Japanese nation. News of the second bomb, so soon after the first, shattered the spirit of resistance that still lingered in some sectors of the government and military. The idea that the United States possessed an unlimited arsenal of such weapons and that they could pulverize one city after another was unbearable. The Japanese government, already in heated deliberation over surrender after Hiroshima, found itself faced with an impossible decision: continuing the fight to the end, as the most radical military advocates advocated, would mean the total annihilation of Japan, city by city, life by life. Accepting surrender, on the other hand, meant facing the humiliation of defeat, something unthinkable for a nation that valued honor above all else. The double atomic catastrophe crushed not only cities but also the very will to fight. Japanese resistance, already weakened by years of war and conventional bombing, was finally broken. On August 15, 1945, 6 days after Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender, ending World War II. The decision was influenced not only by the atomic bombs, but also by the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan and the total exhaustion of Japan's resources and population. The legacy of Nagasaki, an eternal warning. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima, has become a symbol not only of humanity's destructive capacity, but also of the fragility of life and the urgency of peace. The story of Fat Man and Boxcar is a grim reminder of how chance and last-minute decisions can seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives. The city, rebuilt with resilience and determination, today houses a peace park and an atomic bomb museum, monuments that call for the world to never forget what happened there. The end of World War II in the Pacific was forever marked by 2 days of fire, blood, and ash, a legacy that continues to resonate, an eternal warning to future generations. The anatomy of destruction, the Fat Man, and the topography of Nagasaki. The Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device, represented a technological leap forward compared to the uranium Little Boy. Its design was more complex, requiring a plutonium sphere compressed by conventional explosives to reach critical mass. This complexity resulted in greater nuclear fission efficiency, releasing colossal energy. The choice of plutonium also meant that the United States had already mastered the production of a second type of fissile material, a frightening sign of its growing nuclear capability. Nagasaki's topography played a crucial role in how the destruction unfolded. Unlike the Hiroshima plain, Nagasaki was a city built on narrow valleys, with steep mountains dividing it into sections. The bomb was dropped on the Urakami Valley, an industrial and densely populated area. The mountains, while blocking some of the shockwave and heat from reaching some areas of the city, also channeled the force of the blast, concentrating it in the valleys and amplifying the devastation in the areas directly hit. This resulted in near-total destruction within the Urakami Valley, while other parts of the city, protected by the elevations, suffered less severe but still catastrophic damage. The aftermath: chaos, agony, and the struggle for survival. In the minutes and hours following the explosion, Nagasaki descended into indescribable chaos. Those not instantly vaporized or crushed by the shockwave found themselves in an apocalyptic landscape. The air was thick with dust, debris, and the pungent smell of burning flesh and burning materials. Thousands of wounded, many with their skin hanging in strips, wandered aimlessly, blind, disoriented, calling for relatives they would never see again. Water was the only source of hope, but the rivers were filled with bodies and the wells were contaminated. The few remaining hospitals and clinics were quickly overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses, many of them injured, worked tirelessly with minimal resources, trying to alleviate the suffering of the burned, the maimed, and those already beginning to exhibit symptoms of radiation sickness. A lack of knowledge about the effects of radiation made treatment nearly impossible. Many died in agony, without understanding the cause of their deterioration. The survivors, scarred physically and psychologically, would face a life of chronic pain, mysterious illnesses, and the social stigma of being Hibakusha. The Japanese dilemma and the end of the war. The attack on Nagasaki, coming so quickly after Hiroshima, had a crushing psychological impact on the Japanese leadership. Although surrender was already being discussed, the militarist faction still advocated a fight to the last man. The idea that the United States possessed an unlimited supply of such weapons, and the threat that Tokyo or other major cities could be next, made continuation of the war untenable. The Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on the same day as the attack on Nagasaki added another layer of pressure, eliminating any hope of Soviet mediation for a negotiated peace. Emperor Hirohito, who until then had maintained a more ceremonial stance, intervened personally, breaking the impasse in the Supreme War Council. He expressed his desire to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, which demanded unconditional surrender. The emperor's voice, recorded for broadcast to the Japanese people, announced the end of the war on August 15, 1945. It was the first time most Japanese people heard their emperor's voice, a moment of profound emotion and despair for a nation that had never known defeat. The legacy of Nagasaki: ethics, memory, and the nuclear future. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima, remains a grim reminder of humanity's destructive capacity and the complex ethical questions surrounding the use of nuclear weapons. The decision to drop the second bomb, just 3 days after the first, remains a subject of intense historical and moral debate. Was it truly necessary? Did it save American lives by forcing a quicker surrender? Or was it an act of unnecessary cruelty, a demonstration of power for the post-war world? The city of Nagasaki, with its remarkable resilience, rebuilt itself from the ashes. Today, Nagasaki Peace Park and the Atomic Bomb Museum serve as shrines of remembrance, educating visitors about the horrors of nuclear war and advocating for the abolition of all nuclear weapons. The peace statue, with its right arm pointing skyward, symbolizing the threat of the bomb, and its left arm extended horizontally, representing eternal peace, encapsulates Nagasaki's message, a call for a world free of nuclear weapons. Nagasaki's legacy is an eternal warning, an echo of the past that insists on resonating in the present, reminding us of the responsibility humanity bears. Voices from the abyss, survivor stories, and the post-war reality. Beyond the numbers and descriptions of the destruction, the true scale of the Nagasaki tragedy lies in the voices of the survivors. Testimonies like that of Sumiteru Taniguchi, a 16-year-old postman who was less than 2 kilometers from the hypercenter. The skin on his back and arms melted away, exposing muscle and bone. He lived a life of excruciating pain, with wounds that never fully healed, becoming one of the most vehement advocates for nuclear disarmament, or that of Sakue Shimohira, a 10-year-old girl who saw her younger sister crushed by rubble and her mother seriously injured. The memory of the smell of burning flesh and the despair of the wounded stayed with her for the rest of her life. Rescue efforts were chaotic and inadequate. The city's infrastructure was devastated. Roads were blocked, bridges destroyed, and communications cut. The few doctors and nurses who survived were injured and overwhelmed. Outside aid was slow to arrive, and when it did, the scale of the catastrophe was so immense that resources were a drop in the ocean. Many of the injured died from lack of care, infections, or unbearable thirst. Drinking water was scarce, and many drank contaminated water, further exacerbating their health problems. The political context and the urgency of surrender. The decision to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki cannot be viewed in isolation. It was part of a complex geopolitical landscape. The United States, following the success of the Manhattan Project, was determined to use the new weapon to force Japan's unconditional surrender and prevent a ground invasion that, according to estimates, would have cost millions of American and Japanese lives. The first bomb on Hiroshima had not provoked the immediate surrender that Washington had hoped for, in part due to censorship and the Japanese government's difficulty in understanding the nature of the weapon. Furthermore, the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on August 8, 1945, just one day before Nagasaki, added a new layer of urgency. The Soviets, after declaring war, launched a rapid offensive into Japanese-occupied Manchuria. This worried the United States, which wanted a Japanese surrender before the Soviet Union could claim a larger slice of Japanese territory or gain significant influence over the future order of the Pacific. The second bomb, therefore, served not only as a final blow to Japan, but also as a demonstration of power for the Soviet Union, marking the beginning of the Cold War, the long-term consequences, and the struggle of the Nagasaki Hibakusha. The long-term consequences for Nagasaki survivors were as devastating as those of Hiroshima, but with some unique features. Nagasaki's mountainous topography, which concentrated the destruction in specific valleys, resulted in pockets of survivors exposed to varying levels of radiation. This allowed for more detailed studies of the effects of radiation on different populations, albeit at the cost of immense human suffering. The Hibakusha of Nagasaki, like their brethren in Hiroshima, faced a life of chronic illness, discrimination, and the psychological toll of trauma. Many developed leukemia, thyroid, breast, lung, and other cancers. Rates of miscarriage and birth defects were higher among women exposed to radiation. Social discrimination persisted for decades, affecting marriage and employment opportunities. However, the resilience of the Nagasaki Hibakusha was remarkable. They organized, formed associations, and became tireless voices for nuclear disarmament, sharing their stories of pain and hope with the world. Scientific studies conducted in Nagasaki, particularly by the Atomic Bomb Victims Commission, ABCC, and later by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, RERF, provided crucial data on the effects of radiation on the human body. Although controversial due to their initial observational nature without adequate treatment, these studies were fundamental to understanding the risks of radiation exposure and the development of nuclear safety protocols. The Nagasaki tragedy, paradoxically, contributed to the advancement of medical science, but at an incalculable human cost. Nagasaki today, memory, peace, and a future without nuclear weapons. Today, Nagasaki is a city that has risen from the ashes with unwavering determination. Nagasaki Peace Park, with its iconic Statue of Peace, and the Atomic Bomb Museum, are places of pilgrimage and reflection. They not only tell the story of that fateful day, but also convey a universal message of peace and the abolition of nuclear weapons. The city has become a global hub for the anti-nuclear movement, with Hibakusha and activists working tirelessly to ensure that the horror they experienced is never repeated. The story of Nagasaki is a poignant reminder that nuclear war is not an abstraction, but a reality with devastating and lasting consequences for human life and the planet. It is a call to global conscience, a plea for humanity to choose the path of diplomacy, cooperation, and disarmament, rather than mutual annihilation. The echo of Fat Man still resonates in the valleys of Nagasaki, a solemn warning to present and future generations. Peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, compassion, and shared responsibility for a future free from the nuclear shadow. The ethical and historical controversy, the need for the second bomb, the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Nagasaki just 3 days after Hiroshima remains one of the most controversial points in the history of World War II. Defenders of the decision argue that it was crucial in forcing Japan's unconditional surrender, preventing a ground invasion that would have resulted in far greater casualties for both sides. They point to the Japanese militarist faction's persistence in continuing the war, even after Hiroshima and its initial refusal to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. However, critics of the decision raise serious moral and strategic questions. Many historians argue that Japan was already on the brink of surrender, exhausted by the war, conventional bombing, and the naval blockade. The Soviet Union's entry into the war on the same day as the attack on Nagasaki is often cited as a more decisive factor in Japan's surrender than the second bomb. Furthermore, the indiscriminate nature of the weapon, which caused the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, including women and children, is seen by many as a war crime. Controversy also extends to the motivation behind the second attack. Some suggest that Nagasaki was an experiment, an opportunity to test the plutonium bomb under real-world conditions, or a demonstration of power for the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Cold War. The lack of specific advance warning for Nagasaki, unlike Hiroshima, is also a point of contention. Regardless of intentions, the fact remains that Nagasaki became the second and, to date, the last place to experience the wrath of a nuclear weapon in combat. The city and its inhabitants were transformed into a sacrifice, an eternal testament to the unimaginable cost of war and the urgent need to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. The debate over the necessity and morality of the bombing of Nagasaki continues and will likely continue for generations to come, serving as a constant reminder of the complexities and dire consequences of decisions made in times of extreme war, Reconstruction, and the Nagasaki peace message. After the devastation, the task of rebuilding Nagasaki seemed impossible. The city lay in ruins, the population decimated, and the invisible threat of radiation loomed large. Yet with remarkable resilience, the survivors and the Japanese government began the long and arduous process of recovery. The reconstruction was not just physical, it was also a rebuilding of hope and purpose. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima, chose to transform its grief into a universal message of peace. The city became an active center for the anti-nuclear movement, with the creation of institutions such as the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum and Peace Park. These sites are not only memorials, but also educational centers that welcome visitors from around the world, sharing the stories of the Hibakusha and the dangers of nuclear weapons. The Statue of Peace, with its posture symbolizing both threat and hope, and the peace bell, which is rung daily, are powerful symbols of Nagasaki's commitment to a nuclear-free future. The Hibakusha of Nagasaki, despite their ongoing suffering, dedicated their lives to being messengers of peace. They traveled the world, sharing their experiences and warning about the horrors of nuclear war. Their voices, filled with pain and wisdom, are a living testament to the need to abolish these weapons of mass destruction. The story of Nagasaki is, therefore, a tale of tragedy, but also of extraordinary resilience, forgiveness, and a tireless pursuit of global peace. The enduring legacy, science, politics, and collective memory. Nagasaki's legacy extends far beyond its physical borders. Scientifically, the studies of Nagasaki survivors, along with those of Hiroshima, provided invaluable data on the effects of radiation on the human body, influencing medicine, nuclear physics, and radiological safety worldwide. These studies, although ethically questionable in origin, were crucial to understanding the risks associated with nuclear energy and atomic weapons. Politically, Nagasaki solidified the nuclear age and the doctrine of mutually assured deterrence, MAD, which would shape international relations during the Cold War and beyond. The demonstration of the destructive power of atomic bombs led the great powers into an arms race, but also, paradoxically, to unprecedented caution in avoiding a direct conflict that could escalate into a nuclear exchange. Nagasaki is a grim reminder of the point of no return humanity has reached. In the collective memory, Nagasaki, alongside Hiroshima, serves as a universal symbol of the horror of war and the need for peace. The city's history is taught in schools and portrayed in films, books, and works of art, ensuring that the lessons of that fateful day are not forgotten. It is a constant call for future generations to understand the consequences of extreme violence and actively work to build a world where nuclear war is but a distant memory, not an imminent threat. Nagasaki's sacrifice, though horrific, has become a beacon illuminating the path to a future where humanity, having witnessed the abyss, chooses to retreat and embrace peaceful coexistence. The city, once the epicenter of a hellish explosion, today is an epicenter of hope and an unceasing call for the abolition of all nuclear weapons, so that never again will a city be chosen by chance to face such a brutal fate. Hiroshima and Nagasaki forever marked human history as symbols of the devastating power of nuclear weapons and the profound consequences of war. Japan's surrender after these tragedies ended a brutal conflict, but revealed a lasting legacy of suffering, environmental destruction, and lessons about global responsibility. The suffering of survivors and the memory of the destroyed cities continue to alert the world to the dangers of war and the importance of peace, reminding us that, while violence may cease, its scars never completely disappear.